Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, to come back. I would like to, first of all, ask Dr. Ken Noel, who was a graduate student here at the time in 1967 when we conceived the Olympic Project for Human Rights, ironically on a bench that used to sit exactly where that statue is after we left the president's office and was unable to get any redress whatsoever for the issues that we were concerned about. Issues such as segregation in housing, segregated fraternities and sororities, the fact that they had never even interviewed a black candidate for a coaching job, not even in the sports where black athletes predominated, such as football, basketball, and track and field. We were unable to get any kind of redress, not even an audience, in terms of dealing with those issues, and so we sat on a bench exactly where that statue is. Ultimately came to be built, ironically, and decided that there had to be a course of action taken that was outside of conventional routes of addressing such problems. So, Dr. Ken Noel, could you please come over so that people can see that you really exist? He went on to complete a doctorate degree at the University of California at Berkeley, and now, like the rest of us old folks, is retired. Thank you very much. On January 17, 1968, my good friend Louis Lomax, the author of The Negro Revolt, the first black producer at CBS, he produced a show called Mike Wallace at Large, whose first airing was a track called The Hate That Hate Produced, which introduced Malcolm X to the rest of the world. My good friend Louis Lomax set up a meeting between me and Dr. King in New York City because I was very much interested in Dr. King supporting the Olympic Project for Human Rights. The work that he was doing was about broadening the basis of opportunity in American society, particularly in the economic realm. We had raised the question, why should we play where we cannot work? And Dr. King understood the economic implications of that question. We had also been concerned about international issues, the Vietnam War, which he had come out against. We supported him in that, as well as apartheid in South Africa. And thirdly, it was a way of getting youth back in the circle of support for Dr. King, because there had become a split in that regard. Many black youth in particular, such as Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, Huey Newton, Eldridge Cleaver, and others felt that Dr. King and his methods of nonviolent direct action were not effective. This was something that all black youth supported. It was the one thing in 1968 that was supported by Dr. King, the Black Panther Party, H. Rap Brown, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, the National Urban League, as well as the people who were supporting Malcolm X and his efforts in terms of empowering the black community. It was the one thing that there was tremendous agreement on. Dr. King and I talked subsequently to January 17, 1967, about other things that we could collaborate on, that he could bring black youth back into his circle of effort around, but we never got a chance to implement any of those plans because Dr. King, 2.5 months after our January 17th meeting and less than a month and a half after our telephone conversation, was assassinated. But the point of the effort that Dr. King was undertaking was that it was universal, that there were countless arenas of struggle where the people could continue to sustain the flame, the effort, even though one of our brightest lights had been extinguished. It is now 45 years later, and Dr. King's life continues to be an example of that need to sustain the flame. And nothing articulates the scope and character of that need more than his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington 50 years ago. For there he presented the substance of not just his dream, but he presented a guide, a roadmap for all of us in terms of continuing to sustain the struggle, to sustain the flame, to sustain the light of liberty, and so forth. I am always somewhat taken aback when I hear the question, how close are we to achieving Dr. King's dream? Because you see, Dr. King's dream is not something sitting out there up the road like a highway marker or sign reading, "We have arrived." Dr. King's dream is not static, some projection or wish list frozen in time. It is a moving vision, like frames of an epic saga that tell the story of a larger dream. As Dr. King said, his dream is rooted in the history and ongoing evolution of the American dream. It was this ongoing, inextricably intertwined evolution of his dream with the American dream that he spoke of on August 28, 1963. His words from that day echo across the decades to us. Words that implored this nation to live up to the meaning of its creed and to divest itself of its crippling human relations contradictions and injustices. While too often, when the media focuses on the substance of Dr. King's dream at all, that is, when they focus on anything beyond the declaration, "I have a dream," they tend to limit its references to the progress and fortunes of black people, to the questions of progress in black-white relations. That's what the question alludes to. This question of, have we come close to achieving Dr. King's dream? They always look at it in terms of how black people come close to achieving Dr. King's dream, realizing Dr. King's dream. But Dr. King dreamed of an America where, quote, all of God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning. "My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring." Not just the mountains that black people live in the shadows of, but all mountains. So while Dr. King specifically spoke of a day when his 4 little children would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, while he spoke poignantly of a day when the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners would be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood, while he drew a vivid portrait of a day when little black boys and little black girls would sit down and join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers, he was no less adamant in declaring that his dream was of an America that embraced and secured freedom, justice, and equality for all of God's children. He kept coming back to that concept. This understanding is particularly important because Dr. King spoke of all of God's children against the background of a civil rights movement that at the time, and a march on Washington that at the time were severely split on issues of the status and rights of women, on the issue of gay rights, and other issues of that type. It was also the case that the challenges faced by Cesar Chavez and the farm workers were not seen as integral to the civil rights struggle, but as separate and insular, as different. In consequence, there were no Latino speakers headlining the March on Washington. No women were given primetime speaking slots at the 1963 March. The wife of the martyred Medgar Evers, Marilee, had a speech ready but was never allowed to go to the podium and give it. It was simply assumed that in addressing the race issue, gender issues would be automatically addressed, as if women had no reality or circumstances separate from those of the men in their lives. Even for black women, it was simply ignored that a great deal of what happens to them happens to them not because they're black, but because they're women. Relative to any representation of gay issues, neither James Baldwin, the most gifted and heralded protest writer of the era, nor Bayard Rustin, who actually organized the March on Washington, was allowed to speak at the march because they were both openly gay black men. And the movement leadership didn't want, quote, to send the wrong message. In speaking to the aspirations of his dream for all of God's children, Dr. King planted seeds for movement and development that scarcely could have been imagined at the time of the march 50 years ago. The women's movement, the gay movement, the anti-war movement, the environmentalist movement, the student movement, the revolt of the black athlete, all came in the wake of the March on Washington and Dr. King's call for the light of Lady Liberty's torch to shine upon all of God's children. So now we can say passionately and without fear of contradiction that our dream today is rooted in the American dream and the 21st century continuation and extension of Dr. King's dream, that in fact encompasses all of God's children, not just blacks in their relationships with whites, that it envisions a day when all of our children will be judged by the content of their character, the promise of their potential, and the caliber of their competence, which means that we must get busy fighting to establish the spiritual, cultural, educational, economic, and community scaffolding to support our children and their attempts to accomplish that dream for themselves. Our dream today must declare unequivocally that all men and women are created equal and endowed by their creators with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So what has been called a war on women is a war on men too, because women are our mothers, our wives, our sisters, our daughters, our lovers, our mayors, our governors, our legislators, and in 2016, our president, because women are equal. The simple fact is, and has always been, that we men can't keep women in a hole of repression and oppression and diminished opportunity unless we sit right there in that hole with them. The simple fact is that we men are not going anywhere, that women can't go as full and equal partners. We men are not going to be everything that we can be until women are everything that they can be. Similarly, to categorically impugn the status and legitimacy of and respect for any family is to diminish the status, legitimacy, and respect for all families. This is what Dr. King meant when he spoke of all of God's children. Don't demean and disrespect single women struggling to raise children, struggling to hold jobs, struggling to be responsible citizens. One of her children might grow up to be president of the United States, as we have in the White House right now. Bigotry against gay parented families doesn't make male-female parented families more stable or more secure. Bigotry against gay marriage doesn't make marriages between men and women stronger or more enduring. Bashing and bullying LGBT children doesn't make other children better sons or better daughters or better students or better athletes or better citizens or better people. It leaves everyone involved worse off. The community, the school, the bashers, the bullies, and the victims. But it is not just relative to human relations that Dr. King speaks to us down through the years in enunciating his dream. He reminds us that enslaved black people dreamed of an end to slavery only to be subsequently burdened by rampant segregation, a brutal and often violently enforced form of separate and inherently unequal civil and human rights laws and traditions. What he was telling us is that not only must our dream become ever more inclusive, but the challenges that we face are ever evolving, that we live in an ever-changing society. We live in ever-changing times. And if you look at his dream, you can see that it was a dream for ever-changing times. So our goals, our strategies, and the way we frame issues and measure success and progress must change and evolve to accommodate the realities of the ever-evolving struggle. So while we are rightly provoked to action by what civil rights hero Congressman John Lewis characterizes as the Supreme Court putting a knife in the heart of the Voting Rights Act, and by efforts of over 30 states to restrict and repress voting opportunities in ways that have a disparate impact upon minorities, students, poor people, and young people in general, we must not lose sight of the fact that young men of color are more likely to be suspected, more likely to be stopped and frisked, more likely to be arrested, to be incarcerated if convicted, or more usually to be plea bargained into prison, which is, in most states, also means that they are disqualified from voting, disqualified by the hundreds of thousands. So stop and frisk is a voting rights issue. So the whole stop and frisk effort and the disparate outcomes of young men of color in the justice system impact upon voting as well as the economics of a community. In the same sense, it is not just equal pay for equal work that is an economic issue for women and their families. The cuts in women's health care clinics in places like North Carolina, which cut such clinics from 14 down to 1, and in Texas, which cut women's health clinics from 44 down to 4, are also economic issues, not just for these women, but for their families and their communities. Also, through a study of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, we're able to decipher his prescriptions for sustaining the dream and meeting evolving challenges. He speaks first to the need to maintain a sense of the fierce urgency of now. And then he goes on to use the phrase, "Now is the time," over and over again, for impact and emphasis, ending with the declaration, "Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children." Not tomorrow, over somewhere on the other side of Jordan, in the by and by, right now. Dr. King also acknowledged that the path to freedom and justice is hard, even treacherous. He states that I am not unmindful that some of you came out of great trials and tribulations. He could be talking about the conditions today in many of our Black and Latino communities, or the fact that so many of us have relatives who are incarcerated or out of work or out of school. But he quickly adds that we must have faith, that we must continue to work with the faith that even hard times are redemptive. He admonishes us not to wallow in the valley of despair, self-pity, and fear. He states flat out, keep the faith that somehow change will come. He goes on again for emphasis to refer to keeping the faith for these times, ending with the declaration, with this faith, we will be able to work together, to struggle together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that one day we will all be free together. Dr. King also speaks eloquently about the issue of fear. He states over and over, our marches must not lead to a distrust of white people. They have increasingly come to realize that their freedom is inextricably wound up with our own. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. Here, Dr. King explicitly implores us to move on, to fear nothing, to not be turned off or turned around or turned against each other. This message is particularly critical today because we have evolved a national culture of fear, mostly of each other. Fear and fear-mongering have rose to the level of a national pastime and preoccupation, staples in our social and political discourse, life, and so forth in this society. Everybody, it seems, is in fear of somebody. We are fed a steady diet of fear by the media, by assorted other interest groups. Fear the left, fear the right, fear the immigrants, fear the undocumented immigrants, fear the liberals, fear the conservatives, fear the Republicans, fear the Democrats, fear the government, fear the fundamentalists, fear the secular humanists, fear the Muslims who might be terrorists, fear black males wearing hoodies, fear white men wearing badges, fear the rich and their great wealth, fear the poor and their demand for entitlements, fear the banks, fear the government bureaucrats, fear the women demanding health services, fear the Tea Party agenda, fear the gay agenda, and endless documentation of things that somebody wants us to be afraid of. Be whatever you want to be, but be afraid. This is where we are. But as Dr. King realized, this is not who we are. Our national anthem says what? Land of the free and home of the brave. It doesn't say land of the free and home of the afraid. We cannot fear each other and trust each other at the same time. This is what Dr. King meant. We cannot fear each other and move ahead with each other at the same time. We cannot fear each other and share a dream with each other simultaneously. And finally, Dr. King addressed the need for an ongoing struggle in his dream speech. He states, there are those who are constantly asking, when will you be satisfied? After listing a series of injustices that applied then, that had yet to be resolved, Dr. King said, we are not and will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. Only then will all of God's children be free. He keeps putting us all in the same boat. He keeps bringing us all together, insisting on inclusiveness, working with each other and on behalf of each other, always returning to that theme of inclusion. So Dr. King had a dream that he hoped and prayed would become all of our dreams, seamless in the fabric of the American dream. And he left specific directives on how to achieve that end. Keep the faith, because by that faith we shall all be free. Do not be afraid either of the challenges or of each other, and continue the struggle. He understood that the real question confronting subsequent generations would not be if his dream had been achieved, but whether each generation continues to dream and to work toward that more perfect union. That is integral to the American dream. He understood that the challenges of achieving America are ongoing, diverse, and dynamic, that our struggles therefore must be multifaceted and perpetual, and that there could be no final victories. Not a Voting Rights Act, not a women's rights achievement, not progress on gay rights. It is in the very nature of the struggle to achieve America, to achieve that more perfect union, that there are no final victories. So how close are we to achieving Dr. King's dream? To go back to the original question, well, how much is each of us involved in the 21st century versions of that dream on behalf of, quote, all of God's children? The answer to both questions is the same and can only be answered by the person in the mirror. Thank you very much.